My friend dared me to spend the night in an abandoned asylum that's known for being haunted. I knew this was going to be a scary night, but it was nothing compared to what happened to the workers who used to work there. It was originally built in 1890 and took in its first patients in 1893. The asylum would end up housing over 9,000 patients. But the issue was that they didn't have enough staff to go around. This led to a lot of the patients not getting the treatment that they needed, and instead they suffered greatly, which ended up with many of them dying. And then in 1994, the asylum finally closed down. It sat abandoned ever since, until my friend and I decided to check it out one day. We went inside and it really did look like something out of a horror movie. There were bloodstains all over the walls and the floor. Although some of it looked like it could have been painted on, other parts looked way too real. There were also some rooms where we could still see patients sitting in their beds with their mouths open and their eyes staring blankly into space. But as we explored further into the building, we realized that those weren't actually patients at all. They were just life-size dolls that someone had made to look as realistic as possible. We started to hear strange noises coming from the room ahead of us, so we decided to investigate. But then we heard a blood-curdling scream, and this is when I turned around and ran back to the entrance. I told my friend that we needed to get out of there because this place is seriously creepy, but he said he wasn't scared, and that he was going to continue exploring on his own. He told me to get out if I was such a chicken, and that's when I finally gave in and agreed to stay. We walked back into the room where we heard the scream, and it was then that we saw a little girl standing in the corner. She was wearing a hospital gown, and she looked like she was about 10 years old. My friend and I froze in our tracks and just stared at her for a few seconds. That's when she started to walk towards us, and we both started to run for the door. We made it outside, and we were both catching our breath, trying to figure out what just happened. My friend was pale as a sheet, and he was shaking with fear. I told him that I wasn't staying another minute in that place, and that's when we both agreed to never go back. Years later, my friend decided to go back by himself. I begged him not to go, but he said that he was going to prove to me that there is no such thing as ghosts. He went in, and I waited outside in the car. He was going to call me when he found something interesting. I waited, and I waited, but he never called. I eventually went inside to find him, and this is when I discovered something horrifying. I found him on the ground in front of the exact same room that the little girl ghost had appeared in. His phone was lying on the ground next to him, and his flashlight rolled away as I approached it. When I looked closer, I saw that he had a big cut on his neck, and he was slowly bleeding out. I quickly called 911 and stayed on the phone with the operator until the paramedics arrived. They took him away in the ambulance, and I was questioned by the police to see if I had any idea who would want my friend dead. But the thing was, I had no clue. He had made a lot of enemies while he was exploring the asylum, as he had been taping everything and taking pictures without asking permission. So it was clear that somebody wanted revenge. The police investigated, and they were able to track down who had taken the pictures. It turns out that it was a group of teenagers who had snuck into the asylum to vandalize it. They had written some horrible things on the walls, and they even poured paint on the floor to make it look like blood. They had set up cameras and were watching my friend explore the asylum. And when they saw him enter the room where the little girl ghost appeared, they thought it'd be funny to jump scare him. But my friend had panicked and had tried to run away, but the teenagers had followed him, and that's when one of them had slashed his neck. They were arrested and taken in for questioning. But when the police asked them why they had done it, they said that they had only meant to scare him. They said that they had no idea that he'd end up bleeding out from a small cut. This is when I knew that these kids were lying. They had clearly planned to do something horrible, and they were now trying to cover it up. The police seemed to believe them, and so my friend was laid to rest in a cemetery. I visited his grave often in the first few months, but as time passed, I stopped going as often. One day, though, I decided to visit again. I brought flowers, and I sat down on the grass in front of his grave, and this is when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around to see who was walking up, and this is when I saw a young girl in a hospital gown. She had a sad expression on her face, and she looked like she was crying. I asked her, "Can I help you?" But she just shook her head and continued walking. As she got closer, I noticed that she was holding a teddy bear in her arms. And this is when I realized that the little girl ghost wasn't actually a ghost at all. She was a living, breathing human being. And that's when I felt my heart sink. I stood up and started to follow her, and I soon realized that she was headed towards the asylum that had taken her parents. I started running after her, and this is when she turned around and looked at me. Her eyes were filled with sadness, and she opened her mouth like she wanted to say something, but no words came out. I continued following her until we reached the asylum, and then she disappeared inside. I knew I had to go after her, so I followed her in. And this is when I realized that it had been torn down. There was debris everywhere, and the walls had crumbled, revealing the dark and dirty bricks underneath. And then I saw her standing in front of me. She looked back at me and said, "Thank you for coming to save me."
Ow.
She then turned around and walked away. I wanted to talk to her more, but I didn't know where she went, and then I realized that she must have died here. I felt so bad for her and all the other patients who had died there. I promised myself that I would do everything in my power to make sure that their stories wouldn't be forgotten. I went home and started researching the asylum and the history behind it. I found out that the reason why the asylum had become so overcrowded was because people had been pouring into the city, and the local hospitals couldn't keep up with the demand for mental health treatment. The state had decided to open up the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum to house more patients, but they hadn't hired enough staff to take care of them. This had led to a lot of the patients not getting the help they needed, and many of them had ended up dying. When the asylum closed down, all of the records were lost, and nobody knew exactly how many people had died there. I wanted to change that, and that's when I decided to create a documentary about the asylum. I interviewed people who had worked there and explored the abandoned building. I put together a documentary that told the story of the asylum and all of the people who had died there. I posted it online and it went viral. People were shocked to learn about the history of the asylum. Many of them donated money to help me put up a memorial for the patients who had died there. I was able to raise enough money to have a ceremony where we read the names of all the patients who had died. We also put up a plaque in the town square that tells the story of the asylum and all of the people who had died there. I know that nothing will ever bring them back, but I hope that they can finally rest in peace.